this morning will be in Psalms. I know that we normally do Revelations in the morning, but Rick is out of town this morning, so we are going to go back into Psalms. So Psalms 10. Psalms 10 is where we left off. Psalms 10. As you know, I like to open up with, who authored that psalm? Who authored Psalm 10?
I'm going to take a wild guess.
Yeah.
David?
No.
Oh, it's not David.
See, I told you I was going to have this question and everyone's going to say David until the one time it's not David. Matt.
It could be a trick question, though, because
It could be.
all of the Psalms have a superscription. This one, well, most of them.
Yeah.
This one doesn't, and there's an argument to be had that this actually belongs with Psalm 9, which is actually ascribed to David, so maybe it is David.
It could be, yeah. So the way that most Bibles have this broken up is like Matt said. The psalm begins with a short little superscript that essentially says, psalm to the chief musician, accompanied on this instrument. It's a psalm of David or something like that. A lot of psalms begin that way. This one doesn't. It just jumps right into the psalm. Now that could just be that the way this psalm is, David didn't write all the psalms, and so this one just might be anonymous. But there's also the argument that in the midst of all these psalms by David, that this one doesn't tie into that. And as a matter of fact, it kind of seems like it might flow from Psalm 9. So some scholars think that it actually is just a continuation of Psalm 9, and it got split into two psalms, right? Remember, the way that we divide up the Bible in terms of verses and chapters, it wasn't always like that. That's something that we put in to help us organize it and find things in there. So Psalm 9 might actually be Psalm 9 and 10, and we just kind of split it in half. But we don't know. So there's an argument to be made either way, really. So it could be David, or it could be anonymous, right?
When
Addie?
you read the last couple verses of chapter 9, and then go into chapter 1 of 10, it sounds like they're talking about the same subject.
It does, and that's one of the supporting arguments for why they belong together, is that it just sounds like if you read Psalm 9 and go straight into Psalm 10, it just sounds like it keeps going, right? So that could be it. Matt?
And the Septuagint, we often talk about the Greek translation
Mhm.
of the Old Testament. Actually, it is all one psalm, the way things are numbered there. And
Yeah.
also the Latin translations do that too.
Yeah. So this one is really could be a trick question. So I put anonymous, but it also could be David. So this is one where it's just not really clear, right? And sometimes we don't have all the answers completely spelled out for us in the Bible. But whoever the psalmist is, what do they start off asking of God at the very beginning of Psalm 10? The psalmist is asking something of God. What is he asking God?
Doesn't want him to be standing so far off, want him to be near to him.
Yeah, he doesn't want him standing far off. He wants God close, and he's asking why God is distant, right? The psalmist says in verse 1 of Psalm 10, he says, "Why do you stand far away, Lord? Why do you hide yourself in times of trouble?" So the psalmist is questioning God's seeming inactivity in the face of troubles, right? And this is a common question that gets asked in one way or another. And it gets asked by those who are in Christ and outside of Christ, right? If you think about the world outside, many of them ask, well, if God's real, how come he permits things like war or famine or disease? Well, where is he? Why wouldn't he stop those things? And even for those who are faithful Christians, the thought comes to mind sometimes, man, I'm going through something tough. Where's God right now? Why isn't he helping me with this? We just finished the big study through Job. And Job asks questions like that. Lord, why are you so far from me? You know, because he was enduring all this suffering and he looked to God to be his deliverer, and God didn't seem to be delivering him. So he was confused. He didn't understand why this might be the case. And so it's a question that many people struggle with. So my question to you is it right to ask this of God? Just because the psalmist is asking this doesn't necessarily mean it's the right thing to do, right? So is it right to question, where is God? What do you think? Matt?
I think it speaks to an intimacy we should have with God, that we can pour out our heart to Him. We're sorry, or we're upset, or whatever. You know, please help me. Where are you? You know, it's not accusing God. It's just pouring out our heart to God.
Yeah, I agree. And that was one of the big takeaways that we learned from Job. Remember, Job asked these similar questions because he was confused. And he was just having a heart-to-heart with God. He was pouring out all of his feelings and what he thought, what was weighing on his mind. And remember, at the end of Job, God praised him for what he did. Not because he demanded an answer. That part Job got rebuked for. It was the fact that he was pouring out his heart to God that God complimented him on, that he was approving of. And so for us to pour out the things that are weighing heavy on our hearts, on our minds, is a good thing that we can ask. It might sometimes feel a little odd, but this is one of the things that we can learn from the Psalms. Yes?
Well, I think it's okay to ask God these questions, but I know personally, I have asked God, why have these things happened?
Mm-hmm.
Not even only in my own family, but out in the world.
Mm-hmm.
But then but the final thing is, with me is, okay, God, just help me to get through this.
Yeah, and that's what we...
You know what you're doing.
Yeah. And that's what we see coming from many of these Psalms, right? All of us struggle with difficult emotions, right? That's very normal. That's a normal thing to see. And one of the big things that we learn from Psalms that are lamentations, right, is how to deal with those negative emotions. And what you'll often see is someone who's voicing a lamentation will start out by telling God all the things that are burdening their soul. You know, they're bothered by the world, or they're bothered by the situation that they're in, and they're pouring that out. And then you notice the tone usually shifts by the end of the psalm to the psalmist praising God for being their refuge, because they were able to pour out their feelings and then trust that God will be able to oversee and handle everything. And so it teaches us as well how to handle those difficult emotions, how we can pour out our hearts to God in an appropriate way that's not accusing God of negligence or anything like that, but just pouring out what we're struggling with. Yes, Dan.
God is always there for us when we need Him, and I think it's mankind is the one that kind of separates.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, I think God knows our troubles before we even ask Him.
Mm-hmm.
And God wants us to ask Him for things.
Yeah, absolutely. Any other thoughts? Yeah, Addie.
Sometimes by asking these questions, it helps us to build a relationship with God.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
It brings us closer to God because we're trying to figure out what's going on here.
yeah. And it kind of helps you to work through it on your own too, right? If you have someone to talk to, you can kind of voice things out loud and then get your own thoughts sorted straight, right? That's good. Any other thoughts or questions before we continue? Okay. So let's read verses 2 to 4 next. Psalms 10, verses 2 to 4. The psalmist says, "In arrogance the wicked hotly pursue the needy. Let them be caught in the plots which they have devised. For the wicked boasts of his soul's desire, and the greedy person curses and shows disrespect to the Lord. The wicked, in his haughtiness, does not seek him. There is no God in all of his schemes." And so as the psalmist continues, he seems to be expanding on what he meant by his time of troubles. In verse 1, he said that he had times of troubles. And so it sounds like the psalmist is explaining what consists of his times of troubles. And so what does he mention? What are some of the difficulties that he seems to be facing? What's he talking about in verses 2 to 4?
The pride of the poor,
Okay.
and as I read this, it's just the total opposite of verse 1.
What do you mean?
When
How so?
Well, when you get to verse 4, the wicked through the pride of his countenance will not seek after God. God is not in all of his thoughts. Where in verse 1, as we were discussing, you go to God with your problems, your prayers, and this is just the total opposite of verse 1.
Yeah, I agree. This is definitely a contrast. So we have the psalmist who is humble, who is seeking God, right? Versus the wicked in verse 4 who's not seeking God, right? Through arrogance, right? So we can say that the psalmist is maybe dealing with some of these wicked, arrogant people in his life. It seems to be, right?
Right.
He talks about the wicked arrogantly pursuing the needy. He talks about the boastful wicked. He talks about the greedy person who curses God. It sounds like these times of troubles that are frustrating the psalmist right now have to do with these wicked people, right? And so he's describing some of the things he's facing. So I think this is so far in just these first 4 verses, this is a prayer that all of us should be able to identify with, to resonate with, right? How many times have we looked out into the world and been frustrated with what we see? And maybe you pray to, God about that. Like, how come it's like this? Like, how come it has to stay this way right now? When's it going to get better? Just looking out into the world and seeing arrogant people, seeing wicked people, seeing greedy people, it causes times of trouble. And that seems to be what's frustrating the psalmist right here.
Well, many times we have this even right within our own family.
Yeah, it can be very close to home.
You can have an arrogant person that totally will not, they might even tell you that, yes, you're right, but I'm not going to live for Jesus. So what do you do with that person?
Yeah, and it says in verse 4, right, there is no God in all of his schemes, right? So everything that the wicked person is doing, whatever they set about doing, God's not a part of that, right, in their whole life.
That's
Yeah.
their choice.
Yeah, and it's a choice, of course. And so, what is it that the psalmist wants done about this? In verse 2. So the psalmist has this time of trouble, and they're dealing with these wicked people. And so, what do they ask for in verse 2?
That they'll be caught in their own traps. So
That they'll be caught in their own traps, their own schemes, right?
eventually, they will. If not on this earth, they will when they reach the golden gates.
Right. Right. Yeah. And so this is something that we've seen in a couple Psalms so far, right? Is where we have this language of talking about how the devices of the wicked often ensnare them, right? Their plans backfire, essentially. Whatever trap they set, that's what they now fall into. And many times it's shown that it's God that flips that around on them, right? So another way that you could say this, what the psalmist is looking for in verse 2, is he's looking for justice, right? In these times of troubles, the psalmist is seeking out justice. Now, what I like here is that the psalmist is leaving that justice up to God. He's asking God for that justice, right? And we read about that in the Old and the New Testament, where justice, vengeance, those sorts of things, those are God's area, not man's, right? Over in Deuteronomy 32 and verse 35, Deuteronomy chapter 32 and verse 35, it says, "Vengeance is mine, and retribution In due time their foot will slip, for the day of their disaster is near, and the impending things are hurrying to them. So God is promising justice here, and he's going to bring it swiftly. Now that's the Old Testament. Let's look at the New Testament. The New Testament in Romans 12 in verse 19. Romans 12 in verse 19 says, "Never take your own revenge, beloved, but leave room for the wrath of God, for it is written, 'Vengeance is mine, I will repay,' says the Lord." Okay, so we're also cautioned to remember to leave that area to God. Vengeance belongs to God. And so that is what the psalmist is doing. He is putting this in God's hands and asking God to take care of it. So a good lesson for us, right? It's good for us to remember our place versus God's place. You know, we don't need to get out there and lead some holy crusade to cleanse the world of all evil, right? That's not our field. God will take care of that in due time. Ours is to spread the gospel, to spread the message of a better way of living for those around us, right? Okay. Now, let's see. Back over to Psalms. Psalms 10. I ask how much. And what I mean by that is how much does the psalmist want to see this justice? Let's look at verses 5 to 7. In Psalms 10, verse 5 to 7, the psalmist continues after talking about the wicked. He says, "His ways succeed at all times, yet your judgments are on high out of his sight. As for all of his enemies, he snorts at them. He says to himself, 'I will not be moved. Through the generations, I will not be in adversity.' His mouth is full of cursing, deceit, and oppression. Under his tongue is harm and injustice." Okay, so the psalmist talked about the wicked in the first couple verses, and now he's just expanding upon that. He's going into greater detail. And so he's building upon it. You can imagine as the psalmist is going, he's saying, God, the wicked are really bad. And they're even doing all these things. Look at this thing that this guy's doing, and this guy's doing, and this guy's doing, right? So he's just kind of ramping up in explaining how terrible this is, right? And so if someone is getting really passionate and fired up about this, how much do you think that the psalmist wants to see God's justice enacted? A lot, right? If something's bothering you and you keep building on it and building on it and building on it, you really want something done about this. My point is that the psalmist is very passionate about his plea here, right? If something isn't really a big deal to you, you might pray about it and say, and God, if you could also take care of this, I'd appreciate it, right? But if it's the focus of your whole prayer and you're just like, you just keep talking about it and talking about it and talking about it, it's really eating at you and it's really bothering you. And so the psalmist is very passionate in his plea here. And this is where the word lamenting is appropriate, right? Some of the Psalms, especially the Psalms in the beginning of the book of Psalms, focus on laments. It's where the psalmist is frustrated by this seemingly backward situation, right? Lamenting the state of the world. Talking about how, the wicked just seem to do whatever they want. Look at what he says back here in verse 6. He's talking about what the wicked say, right? "I will not be moved. Through the generations, I will not be in adversity." He says that they're full of cursing and deceit and oppression. That under their tongue is harm and injustice. So, not a really nice person, right? Not someone you want to be around. The wicked are always prospering, seems to be the point. And he says that God's judgments are out of his sight. In verse 5. Now, what do you think he means by that? Let's read verse 5 again. He says, "He succeeds at all times, yet your judgments are on high, out of his sight." What does the psalmist mean by that?
Well, I
Matt?
think he-
Oh, sorry.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I think he means that
Okay,
So it doesn't matter to them. They have a different outlook on life.
sure.
Theirs is totally different than a Christian's outlook.
Mm-hmm.
And so God is not in their thoughts.
Okay, so God's not in their thoughts, not in the view of the wicked. Matt, what were you going to say?
Kind of like what we talked about with Job, where, Job was suffering.
Right.
And people who saw that assumed, oh, he's suffering because he did wickedness. Well, at the same token, people could look at someone who's successful and say, oh, he's successful.
Right.
He must be righteous. But, that wasn't true with Job. It's not true here. A lot of times, wicked people are very successful.
Yeah.
And it's frustrating.
Right. Yeah, it's frustrating. And to Shirley's point, it doesn't say that God's judgments aren't happening. It just says the wicked aren't noticing them. They're not seeing them, right? And God's judgment is continually happening. So just because you prosper here for a while doesn't mean that judgment's not coming, right? But the wicked are oblivious to those things and oblivious to the warning signs because God is completely out of their sight, right? Said the wicked sneers at his enemies, his mouth is full of cursing and deceit. And like we said, these are not nice people, and yet life seems grand for them. But this is something that we saw multiple times in Job, right? Job and his friends, they discussed this as well at length, about how there are times when it seems like wicked people prosper through the entirety of their life. Job pointed this out. There are people who are wicked and yet they live long lives, or they're wicked and they live wealthy lives, or whatever the blessing might be here on earth, it seems like they get. But the psalmist isn't done there, because it gets worse, right? Let's read verses 8 to 10. In Psalms 10, verse 8, it says, "He sits in the lurking places of the villages. He kills the innocent in secret places. His eyes surreptitiously watch for the unfortunate. He lurks in secret like a lion in his lair. He lurks to catch the needy. He catches the needy when he pulls him into his net. Then he crushes the needy one who cowers. And unfortunate people fall by his mighty power." Okay? So before, the psalmist was talking about the wicked, and he was saying, how they lie, how they're proud. But now it's really ramped up, right? This is getting much more violent. They're lurking in villages, killing the innocent, watching for the unfortunate. This is getting a lot darker really quick. These wicked are doing terrible things. And again, as you read through the psalm, if you're reading through and not stopping like we're doing here, you see that the psalmist is just building and building and building to this crescendo, right? As he's lamenting the wicked here.
We would call this a predatory
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things it says like a lion, right? What does that remind you of? It reminded me of 1 Peter. 1 Peter 5. In 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 8, it says, "Be of sober spirit and be on the alert. Your adversary, the devil, prowls like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour." Right? And so these wicked are compared to a lion that's on the prowl, looking to devour the needy. And we're told in 1 Peter that that's what the devil does, right? He prowls like a lion, looking for someone to devour. And who is behind the actions of these wicked?
The devil.
The devil, right? So your enemy really is one and the same here.
He's using humans
Right.
as a source to do
Exactly.
his works.
Yeah, exactly. He's
And
got
we see that all around us.
right. He's got people that are falling for lies, and then they're just essentially doing what he wants, right?
It's just like, I call them the devil's angels,
Mhm.
that are out there working.
Right. Pat?
It just shows how powerful Satan is and how conniving he is.
Yeah, it does.
He's not stupid.
Right. All of these temptations that are common to man, right? He knows what works, what catches a lot of people, right? Matt?
It reminds me of what's said in Proverbs 1, verses 8 through 19, where this father is giving his son advice, where he's essentially saying, don't get caught up with these gangs, you know.
Right.
You're going to go and hide and then rob somebody and kill them.
Right.
Because really, it kind of concludes where he says, basically you're shedding your own blood. You're going to
Right.
die by the sword, so to speak. And that's
Right.
kind of what he's saying here.
Yeah, absolutely. So these things are lessons that we see in multiple places throughout the Bible, right? It's not just this one time just here in Psalms. These are things that are repeated and echoed in the Old and New Testament, right? And then just some of the other things he said. He crushes the needy, and he has mighty power. So these are violent people. But at the end of all of that, he has one more thing to say in verse 11. And it's something that tops off this terrible behavior. And we're going to ask what that is. Verse 11 says, speaking of the wicked, he says to himself, God has forgotten. He has hidden his face. He will never see it. Right? So you've noticed the psalmist has started out with, you might say, the least of the bad things the wicked do, and he's built up to the worst of the bad things the wicked do, right? So he talks about their cursing and their lying, and then they're murdering innocent people, and they're lurking in villages, and now what does he conclude it with? He describes one last thing.
See it, he's not gonna care,
Yeah,
so do it,
exactly.
And that's what we see today.
and that's, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. He says that basically they seem to know of God, they're aware of God, right? And they believe he exists, but they think that he has forgotten them or that he will never see their evil deeds.
It really just reminded me of something, sometimes you want to be tempted to do something that you know is displeasing to God. And you think, well, I can do this one time, because God's not going to see this for
Right.
sin. He's not going to know that I did this. Oh, what a mistake that is.
Right. Yeah, I think it's very telling that the psalmist caps off all this terrible, wicked behavior with the fact that their attitude is that God exists, but they can pull one over on him. Right? That just shows an utter lack of understanding of God, a complete lack of closeness to God, and a completely rebellious attitude. Right? Matt?
Depending on your translation, if you look back at verse 4, my translation says at the end of verse 4, all his thoughts are, quote, there is no God. And
Yeah.
so in a sense in which it's almost like bookends. It's like,
Yeah.
there's no God, I'm getting away with all this stuff, I'm successful because God doesn't care, he doesn't exist or whatever.
Yeah, and really those are kind of like the two, I guess, key thoughts, right, with the wicked. Either God doesn't exist or God exists and I'm getting one over on him. So who cares, right? I do whatever I want. So does that reflect our times today?
Oh, yes.
Yeah? It does, doesn't it? And really it's not like it's changed much. You know, we certainly lament our times as well, but look how far back this goes. To Noah and further. It's not like this is a new thing. People have thought this for ages, right? This is actually a common attitude that's been going on for thousands of years, unfortunately, right? And it's something that will probably continue for however long that the earth is around. This will probably continue, unfortunately. Now, after he's described these wicked people, the psalmist now entreats God. He's asking God to do something. Okay? And so we want to see, how does the psalmist entreat God? Let's read verses 12 to 14. And starting in verse 12, the psalmist says, Arise, Lord. God, lift up your hand. Do not forget the humble. Why has the wicked treated God disrespectfully? He has said to himself, You will not require an account. You have seen it, for you have looked at harm and provocation to take it into your hand. The unfortunate commits himself to you. You have been a helper of the orphan. And so how does the psalmist entreat God now?
and he's saying, don't forget us, Lord.
He asks him to lift up his hand and not forget him, right? One of the things he says is he asks God to arise, right? To not forget the humble, right? One of the things that I'm reminded of is a little bit earlier where, it talked about how God laughs at the schemes of the wicked, that he is not moved from his throne. The things that the wicked do not concern God. They have no power, and so God doesn't even have to lift himself from his throne to deal with this. But God's people are asking him to please stir himself for their sake. Please God, get up and help us in our time of need. And so it's like asking for an extra dosing of helping, right? Don't forget the humble. The psalmist says, you have been a helper to the orphan. So he talks about God's past deliverances, right? This is, again, echoing some of the things that David does, right? One of the things that we've seen when David likes to do a psalm or to pray is that he likes to talk about God's past mercies when he's asking for a new mercy, right? God, you helped me do this, and you helped me do that. Now please help me do this new thing, right? Another thing is that the psalmist seems really confused at the wickedness of his fellow man. He says in verse 13, why has the wicked treated God disrespectfully? He's confused by that. Why would you do that? Why? Right? And this is, again, something that we might ask because, when you read the Bible and you see everything that God offers and everything that God's done, why would you want to rebel against God? There's zero benefit to you to do this thing, right? It requires so little of you to be a faithful follower of God. Why would you do this terrible thing? And then, again, like I've already stated, the psalmist makes his case like David, using God's past mercies as a case for future help. So any other thoughts, questions, or comments? We're going to have to leave off here for this morning. We can wrap up Psalms 10 on Wednesday, and then we'll be getting into Psalms 11, so I'd encourage you to read ahead, read Psalms 11. But any final questions or comments before we close?
Well, the only thing I would have to say is that the wicked, they wouldn't even pick up a Bible.
No.
They may not even know the word. They may
Right.
never
Well, and
read
that's
it.
where we come in, right? To help them know the
Yes, that's
word.
where we should come in, but that doesn't always work either.
Well,
So,
That's our challenge, right?
my point is, they just don't know the Bible.
Right,
They don't understand.
right.
They think it's a fairy tale.
About the author, I think 9:19 and 10:12 tells you it's a continuation. Arise, O Lord. Arise, O Lord.
Yeah.
So it seems like it's a continuation.
It's using very similar language, right? Yeah. So again, there's a strong case to be made that 9 and 10 are actually it's a two-parter, right? It's the same psalm, it's just we split it into parts.
Right.
Yeah.
So it would be the same person that's
Right.
writing 9 as 10.
Right. Okay.
And 9 says definitely it was David.
Right. 9 was definitely for sure penned by David. Yep. Any other final closing remarks? All right. Thank you, everyone.